Hey,
Are we on?
hey, we're on.
We're on.
All right, awesome.
Very cool.
Hey everyone, how is everyone doing today? Awesome, sounds great. So super excited about this panel. We have an amazing lineup of panelists today, and we're going to talk about Metaverse, interoperability, and a bunch of related things. So before we kick this off, why don't you guys introduce yourselves? Give us a quick intro on yourself and what you work on.
Sure. I'm Eddy Lazzarin. I'm the head of protocol design and engineering for the crypto team at Andreessen Horowitz.
Winston Robson, co-founder and CEO of WeMeta.
I'm Herman Narula. I'm co-founder and CEO of Improbable.
All right, awesome.
Yeah.
So before getting there, topic is Metaverse, interoperability. Why don't we try to define Metaverse a little bit? So how do you view it? How do you define it? How do you explain it to an average user?
Guess I'll jump in.
Go.
Sure.
We already have a thriving video games industry. Like 2.5 billion people are playing games. Those people are engaging in experiences which are making them more fulfilled, giving them entertainment, allowing them to form new relationships. The Metaverse is the next step in that. It's an opportunity to have a much wider set of experiences that can fulfill people in really different ways. So imagine sports matches with thousands of people in them, with people watching from afar, or music concerts, or massive social gatherings. It's basically an extension of our virtual online lives into something very different, very new.
Yeah, I personally, I totally agree. I'd say maybe a dimension I'd add to my view is that it has to do with the evolution of the internet generally. And it has to do with adding specific properties to the internet that allow it to be more immersive, more complete, more comprehensive. And maybe one way to put it that could be a little heavy is that allows it to compete with the world of atoms more richly, like as an economic substrate, right? Like, for example, the internet today, of course, lacks like a native ability to capture value and scarcity and encode property rights, things like that. You can imagine why those things would be necessary to build a full range of totally immersive, really, really high quality economic experiences that you'd expect for there to be like a rich, even richer internet. That's just kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, I take an even more simple approach. I just kind of describe it as live social media. And so you can think of social media as it connects us all so that we can all see what people are doing, go where people are going, have fun with our friends. Within the Metaverse, you can take that to the next level where it's like you could go talk to people in a side stage or go to a concert, like you said, and then just hop right into a game, hop right into a new experience, hop right onto whatever's next. And so instead of this static, one to the other scrolling sort of thing, it's like a live experience that's immersive, and you can hop from experience to experience and actually just spend time with people, get to share life with people in a way that they don't actually have to be near you, that they could be thousands of miles apart from each other. But it's more shared experience for me, is how I describe it.
I think you both also add another really important dimension to it, which is in traditional video games, they're kind of closed loops of value. People spend time in one game with one group of people having fun. In the real world, culture doesn't work that way, right? You could be at a football match wearing a jersey from a brand you like, listening to a halftime show from a musician you like. So there's a lot more necessary codependence in those experiences that make them great. And I think in the Metaverse, hopefully what we're going to see is the same thing, but in the digital domain. And again, as you say, competing with the world of atoms as well.
Yeah. And a key part of that in my mind is that if you're designing, if you have a closed system, how many different types of participants offering different types of really rich and diverse experiences can you possibly have within a closed economy? Right, that platform fundamentally needs to be absolutely enormous. It almost needs to be unbounded in its size, but allowing it to be open and to have interoperability, to have economic guarantees between the different types of experiences that you can create, that allows a whole new set of participants who build on it in a serious way, right, who take it really, really serious as a first-class platform, as opposed to allowing their business to be sublimated underneath, by the platform that they depend on underneath. Yeah.
So would you say then kind of a Metaverse can only exist on open platforms, kind of blockchain technology and open protocols, or?
My personal take is yes, right?
Okay.
Is that there's a difference between an open Metaverse that supports really, really deep interoperability with all kinds of other experiences and other kinds of builders who can add things and remove them and allow people to go back and forth, versus a fundamentally closed system I would call that like a closed virtual world, maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I think you're probably right, Eddie, but I would make the statement in a slightly more narrow way,
Sure,
which
sure.
is I would say that I don't think decentralization is a hard requirement for attracting builders
Yeah.
and investors.
Yeah, yeah.
But what is a hard requirement is that all the value can't get sucked away by the platform. So when Facebook say, hey, we're going to take 50% of all the transactions of everybody who builds on our network, well, why would a company want to invest their hard-earned money in building
Absolutely.
that? And decentralization is one way, one really good way,
Yep.
to kind of protect the creatives and the builders. But it's a solution to the problem rather than being the only path, is what I would say.
Yeah, I'd agree with the qualification that it doesn't have to be on-chain. There's on-chain aspects, but really the openness is what's important. So the ability to take whatever you're doing here and plug it into there.
The question to me is, where does the network effect accumulate?
Yeah.
If the network effect accumulates to something that only a single party totally unilaterally controls, it just seems very difficult to imagine how they couldn't end up extracting economic rents from controlling it. But if you allow the network effect to accumulate to, say, some interoperability standards, or like a network, or certain key parts of it to on-chain, many key parts off-chain, but there's a diffusion of places that it accumulates, then that whole thing, that whole edifice that's accumulate, that would be the metaverse, right? The whole thing that is accumulating the network effects of interoperability.
Makes sense. So I guess I'm curious, where's the current state of metaverse, right? And I guess maybe to start, I'm curious, out of the audience, how many of you actually participate in metaverse in any shape or form? All right, so that's a good subset, but I guess let's figure out where the world is today. And I don't know, Winston, maybe you have some thoughts you can share.
Yeah, so luckily we track this and across NFT worlds, Somnium Space, Decentraland, Sandbox, and Crypto Voxels. Right now, there's more people at this conference than there are playing any of those games combined. Right now, live. And so we're really, really early, and the question is, where are we going next? But I think a lot of you, when you raise your hands, no offense, but the question is, how do you define the metaverse? Is Twitter metaverse? Is Facebook metaverse? I think that puts us at a really interesting, scary standpoint where if we're saying Facebook is the metaverse, we're kind of giving up before we even get started.
And I just add to that like the quality of experiences we need to reach if we want ordinary consumers to care enough to participate in these systems of value, they've got to be so much higher than what exists today. You know, like conventional video games aren't going anywhere. World of Warcraft and Call of Duty are still going to carry on existing.
So they're actually going backwards. So Call of Duty is re-releasing old games.
Exactly, right?
Call of Duty is out of ideas. No offense.
But nonetheless, there's billions of people that play those games. So I think one of the problems we're trying to solve, and that I think is probably fundamental to all of this, is to make experiences worthwhile enough that interoperability even becomes an interesting question.
Totally.
You know, and those experiences have to match the things that matter to people in real world culture. You know, where are the stadiums full of people? Where are the massive experiences? That's one of the things that I personally think is so key.
Yeah. So I guess continuing on that, right, let's actually try to define a little bit more, like, what does interoperability mean, right, for metaverse? I think, are we talking about value exchange? Are we talking about participation? Are we talking about composability? Right, let's try to define it a little bit more, and then we'll see how we can get there. So, Eddie, do you want to start?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, it's easy to kind of meander in an excessively technical direction. But in my mind, the very, very basic piece is that if someone makes a useful thing in this context, can other people build on it and use it and take it for granted in a way that doesn't surrender like their control of what they're building? And so can they use it as a primitive building block? I think economic value, being able to transfer economic value is a basic start. But you know, to be more specific is, you know, if you can be able to transfer like 3D assets and allow them to be usable across experiences, or maybe even more interestingly, allow people to bring like identity or like the types of data that they want to bring with them to interface with a new application, you can create a feeling of immersion because people can move around, the system is familiar with them, the system knows them. That type of interoperability at a minimum is, I think, a prerequisite for the immersive stuff that we're talking about. So I like, if we had to define it, I'd say it has to do with portability, it has to do with the ability to build on it and take standards for granted, it has to do with allowing composability at a high level.
And I guess before you guys answer this as well, isn't everything sort of interoperable in the blockchain world, right? And so, by default on Ethereum, you can compose contracts, you can transfer value, or are we really talking about kind of interoperability across different blockchains or across different networks? So, yeah.
I mean, I'd say that it would be helpful to break down interoperability into two broad camps, and perhaps we could go deeper, but let's keep it simple. I would say there's technical interoperability. Can this source of information or program interact with this other one? And then much more importantly, there's semantic interoperability. Like if I take my magic sword from one world to another, does that actually mean anything, right? And I think part of the problem is that for semantic interoperability, you need to have a lot more planning, thinking, and consensus on the part of the creatives. Like in a lot of movies and books, you imagine mashing together IPs. So like Master Chief from Halo is going to run into Hogwarts and shoot at Voldemort, right?
I think it can get really...
But that doesn't really make sense, right? You need to think about interoperability in those two ways, and semantic interoperability requires some kind of basis for people to want to create content that works well together.
Yeah, like the transferable item between games, like a common metaphor. I'm a big gamer. I don't know that it makes a ton of sense to me, right? Like on a very, very basic level. But things that do make sense to me that have to do with interoperability is like when you install different types of mods for the same game, and you want those mods to work, or you want to be able to do like a client UI change, and you want that to work with the new kind of world gen system that you like in Minecraft or like Steam Workshop, right? Being able to compose together extensions and mods, like take that deeper. Like what would it look like if you could compose together whole new rewrites of critical parts of the game and allow people to create new games that remix and recombine different parts? Maybe something more like that.
Perhaps. I mean, I think does anyone here play Dungeons and Dragons? Anybody played Dungeons and Dragons? Fan of it? Aware of it? Role-playing games? There we go.
Please.
So Dungeons and Dragons is interesting because it's all about interoperability. You can take your characters and your objects and your rules from world to world, but it's sort of designed with that from the get-go. And I think a lot of the new Web3 gaming and Metaverse companies are going to find more success if they start with that in mind, right? Rather than trying to add it in later.
Because what makes that so interesting in like the Dungeons and Dragons case is that people don't typically take like a special item from one campaign to another campaign.
But they do take...
Right, but they will take like certain homebrew rules. Yeah. Like they might say like, we're just going to play with this setting or things like that. Those things can be reused. So I think... Yeah, I think there's a ton there, but I think
this might be a good point for us to elaborate for the audience. Is like we're talking about games within the metaverse here. So we have like a base layer, which is the metaverse, and then within that you have different games. And it may not make sense to take one thing from one game or one campaign, like you said, to the next. But it may make sense to have it in this base layer, which we call the metaverse.
Yeah.
And so I guess the question is like, what is the difference between interoperability within those games versus this entire thing we call the metaverse?
You want to take a shot?
That's why I asked the question.
I mean, I'd maybe take a shot at it by saying there are some examples of content which literally are not going to be economically feasible unless you solve that problem. Like last year, we did a K-pop concert, put thousands of people into an event with a K-pop star called Alexa. She just won the American Song Contest. Really cool. Imagine if we sold a T-shirt in that event. If that event never happened again, what's the point of buying that T-shirt? Like, where will I ever use it, right? So there's a lot of content and a lot of commerce which is entirely dependent on there being some other environment, some other place where you can take that stuff. And I think that kind of binds metaverse content together a lot more richly than traditional video games, where you don't really need that.
So we established that we're pretty early, and we established that interoperability can be thought of very differently and may or may not make sense. If you had to make actually an analogy to some kind of historical infrastructure / development, where would you place us right now? Right? You can analogy maybe with the internet or with railroads or anything else you can think of. Where do you think we are in that evolution?
Going with railroads?
Ooh, I like your railroad example. You want to give that? I think it's a good example.
Context, Standard Oil, right, ruled the world. When railroads are coming up, the Standard Oil company found out that you can transport oil inside of a barrel that's much less likely to leak than a wooden barrel. From the wooden barrel, they went to the Standard Oil tank car. The railroads never actually built the tank cars themselves because they thought, oh, that's a Standard Oil problem, right? Well, the issue became for the railroads that the Standard Oil tank cars became their #1 source of traffic and revenue. from there, Standard Oil had patented and owned all the tank cars. Nobody else could build them. Nobody else had the ideas to build them. And so Standard Oil owned the means of transportation for this thing we called oil. So from there, they ended up ruling the world. The question is, where are we at in the metaverse story, and who's building these sort of tank cars?
It's funny, I think of it I love that analogy.
Yeah.
I look back even more early historically. So around the first time that we had really big trade routes like the Silk Road, you had languages and cultures meeting, where for the first time people had to like understand completely new ways of looking at the world, and then new languages and new concepts emerged and standardized out of necessity. So I think we're at that really early stage where like these bubbles of value are beginning to meet, beginning to interact. And I don't think there's anything wrong with creating industry bodies or creating groups to try to actually proactively solve these problems. Like something of the Web3 ethos is around let it happen organically. I do think there's benefit in some proactive planning as well. And again, the railroads are a great example.
It's like what is the open source software that becomes
exactly
that, so that we don't have one people owning it, which becomes a decentralized system where everybody owns it.
Exactly.
How do we build that tank car together instead of, let's say you or any of us building that tank car?
Yeah.
And I mean, at the core of it, right, interoperability is all about unification, right, in some sense. So let's talk about like how can we actually, build it a little bit more, right? Is it a combination of, protocol standards, kind of technical committees, collaborations, kind of a, how do you think about it, and what do you do towards actually achieving that?
Yeah, that's a super interesting one. I think the history of open source, the history of protocols, has been a history of incredibly powerful snippets of code that are challenged to monetize. Right? So something I think is really interesting about crypto, and we're definitely at the early days on this, is that you can attach ways to monetize these types of protocols and monetize specific standards, because you can create incentives for people to adopt them. You can create group bodies of owners who can upgrade them and modify them and sort of preserve the network effects that are accumulated to those standards and allow them to sustain themselves. Right? So I think that's a critical piece of the story to me. I think it's just plainly clear that the fundamental tracks and rails of the metaverse will be built by companies that create high quality interoperability standards that have bundled with them the means of disseminating control and accumulating the network effect to something that is still distributed in ownership.
And you said like the ability to monetize, and we see a lot of games monetizing right now on this thing called land. Do you see land as one of those standards, and do you see a whole bunch of people, because I kind of see as land as the primitive in which we build on top of. And right now there's a whole bunch of people building land in a bunch of different ways, and you build on top of it in a number of ways, but there's no easy way to build on top of it.
It's an interesting one. The thing is, I think what makes land easy to conceptualize and what makes it kind of a common asset that we talk about is that we can reason about it in the traditional world, and it has spatial characteristics, and you can say like, okay, there's a space, we can carve up a space, but beyond that, there's not a lot of interoperability standards defined around what it means to have a piece of metaverse land or how to connect them together. I think actually in my mind, it's actually a good example of how early we are, is that that's not really defined yet.
I mean, you buy something and you buy something in the space world, there's no opportunity to take it to Sandbox or to Decentraland or CryptoVoxels.
This is actually an exact problem that we're trying to solve right now.
This is where you guys come in.
So for those of you that don't know, we've started this network called M Squared, which is, to your point, open. And although we're starting it as the original kind of governors, we're going to be opening it up more broadly.
Sure.
And we're working with multiple metaverses to connect basic standards together. So the first one is Bored Apes' Other Side Metaverse.
Right.
And although we can't talk more about their stuff yet, like exactly the questions you guys are asking, how do you define land? How do you define it as something that people can build on top of? What are the economic rights that are guaranteed and not guaranteed?
Exactly.
What does scarcity mean? So I think these are problems that are going to start to get solved. And now there is energy and money coming into the space. I do worry, though, a little bit around some of the older land projects. Like, I worry what will happen if there are crashes in the value of that land because those projects are not maintained or supported. I think that could be quite damaging for the ecosystem as a whole.
It could be incredibly. That's something I worry about quite frequently, is like, what if Decentraland fails to innovate? Like, what if they just get left in the dust by like others?
But you know how many people are in Decentraland right now, right? Which is roughly...
It's about 1,500 right now.
1,500 people, right? So, I mean, I think that future is coming. The question is how do we protect the whole ecosystem if any one project doesn't succeed?
Awesome. So I think we touched on it a little bit, but I want to actually go deeper. What do you think are going to be like some of the challenges in building Metaverse or building some of the interoperability around it? And yeah.
I mean, besides defining standards, defining is extremely difficult, right? We're kind of hand-waving, yeah, they'll define the standards. Actually, that's like a brutally challenging process, and seeking consensus from a bunch of opinionated people with different business objectives is challenging. It's happened. It happens all the time, but it's not. I think it's not straightforward. Another is something kind of subtle, not so subtle about crypto has been that the traditional growth pattern for new startups in the most recent wave of the web has been to find product market fit, find high growth, high engagement products, and then figure out how to monetize them later, right? I don't know if you all remember, there was a whole time when people thought maybe Facebook could never make any money, right? And it was unclear whether they'd ever become profitable, which seems like almost absurd in retrospect. With crypto, you can, because of the way you can decentralize ownership of the assets and distribute them very quickly to participants in the system and so on, you can create liquidity and create a market and create value for those assets maybe before there's a very strong product market fit. And I think that something that we're going to learn, is incredibly important to learn, is that you can't short circuit the innovation process with this. That there's a huge risk. You need to constantly be seeking product market fit, and in fact probably seek it in advance of allowing there to be tradable assets. I think that that's probably just a challenge for people to figure out what that growth process looks like.
You're sort of touching on something I think really important too, which is crypto really has to get away from being in the face of the consumer and being the primary thing that the consumer is thinking about when it comes to a product or an experience around the metaverse. Like, it needs to become like a technical layer, a protocol, a solution. Like, people shouldn't have to worry about how their MasterCard or Visa payment works, right? And they certainly shouldn't be thinking about making consumer investments in unmade products at such an early stage. Like, that is going to get regulated, and that sounds dangerously like the early days of the stock market. You know, when we saw all kinds of crazy manipulation and all sorts of problems. So I do think there are real dangers with what you're describing.
There will always be people who care about like the underlying, right? There's people who like deliberately choose like an AMD or an Intel processor.
But they're never going to be the majority.
Exactly. But the mainstreaming requires that people understand like loosely the kinds of trade-offs they're making, but not necessarily at a ultra low level. But you know, of course, I think it's maybe critically important about crypto. Something that I love is that the deep transparency means that should you choose to perform deep diligence and really understand the thing that you're building on or taking advantage of and relying on, you can do that, which is not always true for, like, how much can I really learn about like how a credit card works as a consumer, right, or something like that.
So, I mean, I think we talked about like having an ideal and unified experience and a standard for all of this, but at the same time we're early. So how do you think the path is going to be? Where are we going to see many standards, over the coming years compete with one another? From, and an end goal, it's ideal to have everything unified, but in the early days, it's potentially actually good to have some diversity in the standards, right? To actually experiment, to see what works, what doesn't work.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, what do you think is going to happen in the short term, and how do you see that path? Is it going to converge?
The short term is chaos in my mind, right? Because we're talking about with almost no exceptions, permissionless systems, which means anybody can create standards, which means total chaos, which is great because that chaos is the substrate of innovation, right? It means that there's all kinds of experiments, some will work spectacularly, some won't, but in the end, we will move more quickly. If you're relying on a single specific big tech company to create the standard, if they kind of don't do it right, you're done. There's very little opportunity for competition at those levels in the stack. So I see short-term chaos in the wonderful sense, right? In the sense of all kinds of choice, all kinds of opportunities, maybe confusing for some, but for people who want to build that thing, there will hopefully be many types of options.
And I guess on that, because it's going to be chaos, do you see the growth to be pretty slow in the first days because like things still figuring out,
That's a great question. That's a great question.
Growth has been incredibly slow. I mean, you see Decentraland go up, down as far as user counts.
Yeah.
Even in December, they were around 4,000 users concurrently at any given time. Now they're around 1,500. And so I think what we have is like a whole bunch of projects who've gotten a large, like an incredible amount of funding based off the product and the number of users they have. And so we're going to see them try to innovate and survive, and then there'll be ones that survive. There'll be other competitors that come along that get funding. And so I think we'll ultimately guide towards this like one standard, this one thing we call the metaverse. And God willing, it's decentralized. Right now, it's very, very decentralized because nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows what's going on. So we have like all these different standards for lands. I mean, you go look at the contracts for lands. Every single one is different. You can't even come up with a subgraph for you can't even come up with a standard subgraph for the metaverse. And so when we get to more of that standard, that'll be really interesting. But I guess what we're asking is like, what does the user experience look like when we get to that point?
I'll say briefly. I know you want to say something, Herman. But
No, but go for it.
Briefly, like with regard to pace, I actually think it will not. It won't be slow. I think it won't obviously be fast. I think it will be in fits and starts, right? Because I think as when the right standard emerges, if it really is superior for whatever we're talking about, whether it's like rendering 3D assets or whether it's for representing land in a way that other people can build on, whatever. If it's the right one, I think it has potential to grow extremely quickly because of the permissionless properties of these things, right? Everybody can pile in. And of course, if this right standard isn't found, then we need to wait for all the different people to kind of experiment and for things to collect properly. This is why when a big centralized tech company picks the right standard, they can get incredible growth very quickly because they pick the right thing, everybody can glom onto it. And if they don't, then they have to kind of muscle the thing into existence. It can take forever, it can be tortured, drawn out experience. I see this as a little bit more fits and starts.
I think we need to be really careful here. Like, we're at a crypto conference, we all are aware of and like and think about crypto problems. Until there's an experience more than like a few thousand people want to use, none of this matters. And when there is an experience that is even as popular as an averagely popular game, like, you have to remember that you're talking about a few thousand people here in the metaverse.
Right.
The biggest global video games have hundreds of millions of users. Like in Asia, for example, there are games that have, they're like countries in terms of scale. Look at Fortnite overall. So I think a single really successful experience is going to have a very disproportionate power in setting standards in other ways. And I think what's really important, and where I really align with Eddy, is we need to create a culture of alliances and contributions from companies so that when that inevitably happens with that power law, there's at least an incentive structure to try to make it open. Because the alternative is someone will just make a really big central video game that does very well and dictate standards to everybody else. And that's not an outcome we want.
Awesome. And I guess my last question then, so kind of going back to the experiences first, I think, can you think of one simple experience that you think you would like to see? And I think a second question is, what do you think the end game is, right? And, number of users, number of experiences, interactions, like how would you think about it? And I think we only have a couple of minutes, so.
So I'm super biased on this one. So I gotta be honest, and you guys are investors in us, so I'm even more biased. But look, I think the first experience for me that I'm excited about is, which we do routinely now, is putting not 10 or 100 people, but tens of thousands of people all into a single virtual environment, all able to talk at the same time, all able to interact together. And we've done a lot of tests like this, but actually on the 16th of July, we're doing First Trip with the Bored Apes Yacht Club, just taking a lot of this technology and putting it there. I think these massive social events, they excite me because they don't happen in video games. And that makes them different, and that makes them unique, and that makes them something that a lot of people in the real world don't have genuine access to. So I think that's step one. I think after that, finding gameplay that's really compelling in a play-to-earn context, no one's done that yet. I don't really see a single play-to-earn game out there that is genuinely fun without the play-to-earn components. But maybe I'm biased, and I don't know. What do you guys think?
No, there's no fun games. I'd say honestly, like a real social experience that's in real life. Like one thing we helped with last year was the New Year's Eve ball drop. Actually seeing that work at a scale where there's like hundreds of thousands of people attending, where you have more people attending inside of the metaverse than on TV. That's what I would like to see.
Totally agree.
I think we need something like you guys.
Totally agree. That's exactly.
But it's like if we could just take everybody off the TV and get them into this metaverse experience where they're actually sharing life with people. That's what I want to see.
Totally.
So that's where I'm going to go, and I want all the data to be accessible to that's basically everybody.
Yeah, sure. I know we only have a few seconds left, but I totally agree with Herman. I want to see the huge like gigantic stadium experience.
That's the
And
magic.
again, it's super exciting. I'd say like my pie in the sky is maybe seeing what a totally decentralized game looks like, right? And that's like a game where the full game state is on some programmable substrate where other people can make clients. This is kind of the Dark Forest game vision, maybe taken to its extreme. I know some people are working on it. It's super exciting. It's a ways out. It's quite a ways out. There's many technical hurdles, but I think it's really cool. The modder in me gets really excited about that kind of thing. So.
Awesome. Well, I know we're out of time. Thank you guys so much for spending time with us, and thanks everybody for joining the panel.